Welcome back to our special coverage of a truly remarkable day in American politics. President Obama meeting face-to-face with House Republicans and jousting with them live on television. Mr. Obama's final exchange of the day today proved to be one of the most feisty. The president locking horns with Republican Congressman Jeb Hensarling of Texas. Mr. Hensarling is a member of the House Budget Committee, and he attempted to lay into President Obama over the country's rising national debt.
Mr. President, a year ago, I had an opportunity to speak to you about the national debt. And something that you and I have in common is we both have small children.
Absolutely.
And I left that conversation really feeling your sincere commitment to ensuring that our children, our nation's children, do not inherit an unconscionable debt. We know that under current law, that government, the cost of government, is due to grow from 20% of our economy to 40% of our economy. And right about the time our children are leaving college and getting that first job. Mr. President, shortly after that conversation a year ago, the Republicans proposed a budget that ensured that government did not grow beyond the historical standard of 20% of GDP. It was a budget that actually froze immediately non-defense discretionary spending. It spent $5 trillion less than ultimately what was enacted into law. And unfortunately, I believe that budget was ignored. And since that budget was ignored, what were the old annual deficits under Republicans have now become the monthly deficits under Democrats. The national debt has increased 30%. Now, Mr. President, I know you believe, and I understand the argument, and I respect the view that the spending is necessary due to the recession. Many of us believe, frankly, it's part of the problem, not part of the solution, but I understand and I respect your view. But this is what I don't understand, Mr. President. After that discussion, your administration proposed a budget that would triple the national debt over the next 10 years. Surely you don't believe 10 years from now we will still be mired in this recession. It proposed new entitlement spending and moved the cost of government to almost 24.5% of the economy. Now, very soon, Mr. President, you're due to submit a new budget. And my question
Jim,
is...
I know there's a question in there somewhere, because you're making a whole bunch of assertions, half of which I disagree with, and I'm having to sit here listening to them. At some point, I know you're going to let me answer.
That's the question. You are soon to submit a new budget, Mr. President. Will that new budget, like your old budget, triple the national debt and continue to take us down the path of increasing the cost of government to almost 25% of our economy? That's the question, Mr. President.
Jim, with all due respect, I've just got to take this last question as an example of how it's very hard to have the kind of bipartisan work that we're going to do, because the whole question was structured as a talking point for running a campaign. Now, look, let's talk about the budget once again, because I'll go through it with you line by line. The fact of the matter is that when we came into office, the deficit was $1.3 trillion. 1.3. So when you say that suddenly I've got a monthly budget that is higher than the annual, or a monthly deficit that's higher than the annual deficit left by the Republicans, that's factually just not true. And you know it's not true. And what is true is that we came in already with a $1.3 trillion deficit before I had passed any law. What is true is we came in with $8 trillion worth of debt over the next decade. Had nothing to do with anything that we had done. It had to do with the fact that in 2000, when there was a budget surplus of $200 billion, you had a Republican administration and a Republican Congress, and we had 2 tax cuts that weren't paid for. You had a prescription drug plan, the biggest entitlement plan, by the way, in several decades, that was passed without it being paid for. You had 2 wars that were done through supplementals. And then you had $3 trillion projected because of the lost revenue of this recession. That's $8 trillion. Now, we increased it by $1 trillion because of the spending that we had to make on the stimulus. I am happy to have any independent fact checker out there take a look at your presentation versus mine in terms of the accuracy of what I just said.
Oh, pick me, pick me, pick me. Did somebody say fact check? Here goes. Let's take President Obama's claims first. His claim that he came into office already saddled with a $1.3 trillion deficit is close. The Congressional Budget Office actually rounds it to $1.2 trillion, not $1.3 trillion, if you want to pick that nit. The president's claim that his predecessors piled up $8 trillion of debt before he even came into office. True. Budget analysts say when you factor in the Bush tax cuts, the national debt topped $8 trillion as of last January when President Obama was sworn in. Now, as for the Congressman Henserling, during his question, he accused President Obama of proposing a budget that would, quote, triple the national debt over the next 10 years. According to numbers released this week by the CBO, the national debt is projected to double over the next decade, not triple, as Mr. Henserling twice insisted. The national debt was $7.5 trillion at the end of 2009. It's projected to be $14.3 trillion by the end of 2019. That would be double, not triple. So Mr. Henserling basically got that one wrong. Mr. Henserling also claimed that the House Republican budget would have prevented government spending from growing beyond 20% of GDP. That was their proposal. He said the budget would freeze non-defense discretionary spending. That was also their proposal. And he claimed that the Republican budget was largely ignored. Also true. It should be noted in fairness, however, that the Republican budget was proposed without any numbers in it, which frankly made it easier to ignore. We do have one final fact check here.
Jim's going to wrap things up. Jim, I know there's a question in there somewhere. Jim, with all due respect.
The president is wrong. We can report unequivocally tonight that it's Jeb Henserling, not Jim. Jeb, not Jim. Much more of President Obama's final exchange with House Republicans when we come back. You're watching a special edition of MSNBC President's Question Time.